All right, can you guys hear me at home? Anyone? Yay. Okay. Just give it another minute here and we will start. Okay, everyone at home, can you see my screen as well? Anyone?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The snow has started down here in Apple Valley. How about everybody else at home?
It's kind of raining on the west side here.
Is it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's why this is supposed to be such a mess. Snow and rain, snow and rain. All right, I will go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for joining us. Today is about inspections and low appraisals. We thought this was an important subject to discuss because over the last few years, not a lot of inspections have been happening. And even if we were getting low appraisals, so many offers were had appraisal clauses in them that were covering those gaps. So it's just a good topic for us to revisit now that we're getting into, if you will, a bit more balanced market where we're seeing inspections and those types of things again. So obviously this is meant to be interactive. Nicole's here, she's taking over and she's going to present the whole thing. Just kidding. But honestly, for our more experienced agents, speak up if there's something you want to add. And newer agents, don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask questions if you have them, right? That's the whole goal of this. So, all right. Using the proper forms, this is what I first want to discuss is, do you know the difference between an amendment and addendum and which one is to be used for the inspection negotiations? I always remember it, addendum, ADD, you're adding to the purchase agreement. So you use an addendum before the purchase agreement signed because you're adding additional terms to the purchase agreement. An amendment is used after a fully executed purchase agreement because you are amending the original terms of the contract. So the ADD, that's why I have that in caps, because that's kind of always how I mentally remember which form to use for which. At the end of the day, is it really going to matter? I mean, you have a signed agreement between buyer and seller, but I will tell you that you will have certain agents who might call you out on it if you use an addendum versus an amendment. You know, and it just maybe doesn't make you look as educated and experienced in real estate. So just know which form you're using for what thing. And typically or technically when you're negotiating inspection items, post PA signatures, you would be using an amendment. So this is an example, and this is a real life. I had to retype this, so it wasn't an EXP agent, just to be clear. But this was an amendment one of the agents on my prior team actually received. So let's read through it. There's also a lot of typo errors in here, but buyer requested from seller to fix the following. Garage door doesn't close and is missing side door and outlet cover is missing. Gutters are missing. 2 filters are missing filters. Kitchen sink leaks both sides and upstairs sink leaks drains near sauna. Meter bedroom water did turn. The water, Heather, utilities room is leaking near drain. 3 bedrooms closed need to be fixed. 2 outlet has no power at all and house need GFCI without the kitchen, bathroom, and upstairs hallway. I won't read it all, but I think my favorite line from this is sub panel basement is missing cover. Oh no, it's the next line. Main panel is missing thing and need to be look at it. So like I said, this was a real life, actually me and this agent were way up north at her cabin and she got this and I was like, oh my gosh. So we could have had the seller sign this, right? And like, could have argued like you had no call to action on this thing. Like, are you just informing me of what, I don't even really know what you're informing me of because this is so poorly written. But at the end of the day, you know, I said, look, you could have our sellers just sign this and move on and not do anything, but that's also not creating a very clean transaction for either party when obviously the buyer's expectations, and even though it's not our responsibility of managing buyer's expectations when we represent the seller, there was still just some question on like, is this really in our seller's best interest to even have them sign this and get into this mess? So she was going to go back to the agent and have him rewrite it. And I was like, you know what, actually, why don't you just find out what he wants and you write it so that we can all be on the same page. We can giggle at this and I know it's extreme, even though it is a, like I said, real life story, but again, there's no call to action here. Like main panel is missing thing and need to be look at it. Okay, what thing are we missing? Who do you want to look at this? Right? Like does the seller just go down and take a look and flick the thing and say it's fine, or do we want an electrician? So just writing clear and concise amendments is super important. So here's a sample one that I have. I typically start mine with seller to complete the following repairs at seller's expense prior to closing, right? We're addressing who's completing the repairs and when they need to complete them by. Then I have outlined the things that I want them to do, where I want them to do it, and who I expect to have do it. So licensed I had a typo here. Licensed electrician to replace GFCI outlet and kitchen. And then I put to the left of the kitchen sink, in the bathroom, to the right of the bathroom sink, and outlet closest to the tub in the laundry room. So here we identified who we want to have that done, what they're doing in the specific location in which they're doing it. Licensed HVAC specialist show to come out, inspect, clean, and make any recommended repairs to furnace and AC. So like a lot of times you'll have an inspector just say, hey, the furnace and AC seems to be in working order, but it's older. Maybe you should have an HVAC specialist out. So I identified having the HVAC person out, not only for them to clean and inspect, but also make any repairs, right? Because if you don't include that in there, they could have an HVAC person out, clean and inspect it. HVAC individual could just say, oh, well, it needs a new whatever, and it could be a $50 part, and the seller doesn't fix it because you didn't ask for it. You just said for them to have it clean and inspected. Seller to install smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors. Going a little bit a step back, and I actually have one right now where when the buyer went under contract, I knew it needed smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, and in fact, it had a Federal Pacific electrical panel. And in my purchase agreement, I asked for all of those to be replaced prior to the appraisal. And I specifically indicated in my purchase agreement that I wanted the seller to complete those items before the appraisal, so we didn't have a reinspect issue come up. And then licensed plumber to identify and make any recommended repairs, and seller to provide proof of repairs and paid in full invoices at least 7 days prior to closing. Again, you don't have to follow this exact timeline, exact verbiage, but you have in here who you're expecting to do the repairs, when you want them completed by, and for the seller to provide proof of any repairs. Another thing that I would recommend to people is if you have like a laundry list of items, or if the whole deal is going a little bit south, or you're not trusting someone, maybe don't wait to do another walkthrough until the day before day of closing, right? Like it might be beneficial for you to get the buyer in there a few weeks before closing to take a look at the repairs, because if there's a laundry list of items, or if you have a very picky buyer, or you have a seller who's just been a little bit shady throughout the whole deal and you're worried about their actual completion of these repairs, if you're waiting until that last minute, the final walkthrough, it doesn't give you a whole lot of time to revisit these topics with the other side before closing. So that's just another thought there. So helpful tips and reminders, what, when, and whom is to complete the repairs. Amendments should be so clearly written that there's no question between parties on what is expected. Be aware that it falls on the buyer, aka buyer's agent, to ensure that you have the inspections negotiated through prior to your expiration date. Simply having the documents submitted in time does not fulfill the buyer's obligations. If seller refuses to respond to any request that you put in, your next step is to submit a cancellation or make sure buyer is comfortable moving forward with purchasing the property as is. I know that this seems like real estate 101 to a lot of you. I just had an agent this weekend call me. We represented the seller, but inspection period was done Saturday night, and the buyer's agent had just submitted the request Saturday at like 4, and the agent called me like, well, my sellers aren't responding. What do I do? And I said, we represent the seller. We don't have to do anything. It's really falls on the buyer for them to submit a cancellation or decide what their next steps are. There's nothing in the purchase agreement that makes the seller obligated to respond to any repairs. So it's all on the buyer's agent. Nicole or anybody else in the room or on Zoom have anything else to add on the inspection piece?
Yeah, I would say.
Make sure when I've always
Oh,
learned, I
hold on,
guess,
please.
can you hear me?
I'm not sure who's speaking on Zoom, but I have someone speaking in office. Can you
Oh,
hold on one second? Okay, go ahead, Nicole.
So to kind of tag off of what Cassie was just saying, like if you're running up against the deadline and you're representing the buyer, in the past, one thing I've done is sent a cancellation as one document and then the inspection as the other document, and just say, realize and like call and talk to the agents, they realize we don't want to cancel, but because we're running up against the deadline and your seller's not responding, we're being forced to do this.
Yeah, we want to cover ourselves. I've done that too. I've actually done 3. I've sent the amendment, I've sent a extension
Yeah,
and a cancellation.
yeah,
Have your seller sign one of these. You know, our intent isn't to cancel. We'd
Right.
very much like to negotiate through this or work through this with you,
Yeah.
but because we're hitting the deadline here, I have to cover and protect my buyers.
Yep.
I didn't catch who was speaking at home. Who was that?
that was me, Cassie.
I can't hardly hear you. Who is it?
Yeah. I don't know could be my computer.
Well, it could be ours too. Usually you're over the owl anyways. I can't see who it is either. Who's speaking?
I can hear you, Jeff.
Oh, it's Jeff. Okay, Jeff, go ahead.
I don't know if you guys can hear me or not, but
Yes.
inspection amendment, I've always learned as well that you need to stipulate, if you cancel within your inspection period, the earnest money is directed in the purchase agreement, but in that you need to stipulate if the work's not completed. So in that the amendment example, 7 days prior to closing, if it's not done, you have to stipulate what rights does the buyer still retain. So if the XYZ electrical work's not done, does the buyer reserve the right to cancel? And also what happens to the earnest money if that buyer cancels? Because if that buyer cancels 7 days before closing, the seller is going to want to retain the earnest money if that electrical work's not done, if that's why the buyer's canceling, right? But if the buyer, you have to stipulate in that amendment. Maybe I'm getting ahead of where we're at, Cassie, but that's what I've always learned is with every amendment you write, you should be stipulating what happens to the earnest money if it's not done and it cancels because of that.
So
Value.
for agents at home, Jeff, I heard you. He was stating that he had always learned that in the amendment, you should also include what would happen with earnest money if seller doesn't fulfill the agreement to complete the repairs. I mean, is it extra protection? But you could argue this is an agreement that the seller made to do, and they're not fulfilling their portion of the agreement either by completing the items in the amendment. So, and at the end of the day, you could direct who the earnest money is to go to, but if the seller wants to argue that piece, a purchase agreement is not canceled unless all parties sign the cancellation, period, point blank. So even if you had an amendment with these repairs agreed upon, and it stated that if the seller didn't complete the repairs, the earnest money was to be returned to buyer, you still can't force the seller's hand at signing a cancellation. And without that signed cancellation, no earnest money can be released. I mean, sure, I think it's an extra protection if you want. I don't know that it's 100% necessary, but, you know, my guess is maybe that did come from someone that got burned at one point who just adds extra verbiage in there to be 100% clear on all parties. I've never personally done it because I feel like the argument is if they don't complete it, then they haven't fulfilled their obligation in that amendment. Anybody else at home have anything? All right, so that ends the amendments piece on negotiating inspections and moving on to low appraisals. I know we've talked about this a lot, but VA is the only lending product that has Tidewater, which means if the appraiser is not finding comps to justify the value of the purchase price, the appraiser reaches out to the lender who will contact the agent who can provide comps in supporting the value. It's one really nice thing about VA, in my opinion. It just gives you the opportunity to prevent a low appraisal in the first place. I wanted to bring this up, and I know we've talked about it in the past, but until you're in it, I think you don't really realize like what Tidewater is. And you get the call from a lender that says, well, we're in Tidewater, and you're going, the heck does that mean? Because it's also a weird term. I guess I've never looked up where that came from. Does anybody else? Maybe I'll have to do that, or maybe Matt or Colin can tell us. Have any idea where the term Tidewater comes in? I mean, we know what it means. I just explained it, but do we have any idea why it's called Tidewater? All right, Matt's gonna look it up, but I'll move on. Conventional and the FHA don't provide that same process. So what do you do with a low appraisal? As we talked about when we started this training, like the last few years, a lot of buyers were agreeing to pay any gap in that. And if they didn't, seller really was able to kind of move on to another buyer, and especially if it wasn't FHA, try and get another appraisal. So option one, try and renegotiate the purchase price. As buyer's agent, you can inform the seller's agent that the home didn't appraise and ask for a reduction in the price from the seller to match the appraisal. That would be the first option. Sometimes sellers and buyers will meet halfway on the deficit. Seller will reduce the price and then the buyer can come up with the remainder difference in cash. I oftentimes with FHA buyers feel like I find that they don't have a lot of that extra cash to make that work. The last 2 years, I don't know where everybody came up with the money that they had, but clearly that's come to an end. So I think we're going to see a lot of this again. It's important to know that if the loan product that the buyer is using is FHA, that the appraisal remains with the property for 6 months. So this can be used as an advantage in the negotiations for an FHA buyer. And you as a listing agent, if you're representing a seller with a FHA buyer and the appraisal comes in low, and if the seller is adamant about not reducing their price, that's fine. You can go back to market, but your only option then is a conventional buyer. You can't get another FHA buyer unless they plan on waiting out that 6 months that the FHA appraisal sticks with the property. FHA and VA. Conventional is the only one where you could like cancel out that appraisal is null and void. A new appraisal can get ordered, and frankly, I've seen them come in
So
different.
I had
Angie's speaking. I don't know if you guys can hear it at home because I don't think the owl is working.
I had a buyer who was using Rocket against my advice, but they were, and their appraisal came in low. And I advised them to try using a different lender. And so they ordered a new appraisal with the new lender and it came in over.
Yep,
So it really depends on who you're using as well.
it does. Agree. And, you know, that's another thing that I counsel buyers on, like you said, despite your best efforts, but I explained to them, like, especially the last couple of years, like your online lenders and out of town lenders, like listing agents are looking at and I've even looked at like, I'll get the appraisal request and see that, you know, I've got a property in Andover and the appraiser's coming from Duluth or something. And I'm like, how do they know this market? Like they don't.
So
Um,
like as a listing agent, are you being proactive with comps that the appraiser is using? How do we feel about that?
what do you mean? Like,
Bringing comps and leaving them at the house for the appraiser to review?
Nicole asked how we feel about bringing comps to the house and leaving them at the house to review. I've always been told that appraisers technically aren't supposed to
Right, it's
take
like outside
information from
influence.
us. It's outside influence. Um, you know, I guess it doesn't hurt. If you feel like, right. If you feel like you're,
I personally have never done that.
I haven't either.
I know that there are agents that have done it. In my experience, just in talking to appraisers, I think it pisses them off.
That's actually
Because
on my
they're-
next
because
slide.
They're like personally offended, like, what, you don't think I
They know how to do my job. Yep.
Right? So, personally, I don't do that.
I don't personally do it either. Interestingly enough, I've had appraisers outside of VA programs reach out to me, which I
And
was
to-
grateful for because I also felt like that may be against their rules, but that's their rules. Like you reached out to me, so
Well, and I've had appraisers call me saying, hey, I'm having a hard time with this value. What can you tell me about the situation? Or
Yeah. How many
how did you-
offers did you
How
have?
many offers did you have? How did you come, how did you come to your list price? Things like that. So some appraisers
We'll take into
will take
consideration.
some of your feedback into consideration. I don't think appraisers are out there to like ruin your deal.
No.
right? Like. just
But they're under a
doing
lot
their-
more scrutiny because of the last
Yeah.
housing market recession that they were blamed for a lot of the inflation that happened. So they,
Like, if they get, if whoever, the powers that be, think that an appraiser is overinflating a price and the house isn't worth that, they could be accused of mortgage fraud
right.
and they can lose their appraisal license. So appraisers are like way more cautious about that kind of thing than they used to be, especially if they've been appraising for a long time.
Right. So option two, you know, the first one was to negotiate between buyers and sellers on low appraisal. The second one is you can challenge and appeal the appraisal. First, confirm with the buyer that they even want to appeal, right? I've experienced buyers who feel like, well, no, if that's what the appraiser came back at, that's what the house is worth. And I don't want to appeal this because I don't want to overpay. I've experienced that before. But this is a time for agents, again, get permission from the buyers to release the appraisals, to review the appraisal for any missed or inaccurate information, review things like square footage, comps used. And then an appeal is drafted to the appraiser asking for reconsideration. And this goes back to Nicole's point. The appeal process is different for every lender. Some have specific forms they require you to fill out. Some ask you to send all the info to them and they will prepare the appeal to the appraiser. So just make sure you connect with the lender to discuss their specific appeal process. But here's where I just said to Nicole's point, you are challenging the appraiser themselves on the value and ultimately they ultimately hold all the control. So make sure you're just polite and professional in your appeal as well.
I have had success in appealing appraisals. Some of it is the approach that
Right.
you take with the appraiser, you know, and like Kassie just said, like, be polite and professional, don't be accusatory,
Right.
you know.
Like, you're such an idiot. How did you miss the fourth bedroom? Even if you feel like they're an idiot.
Right. Appraisers are human as well, and stuff can get missed. So, and especially kind of like we talked about at the beginning, if they're not super familiar with the area, like there could be a specific neighborhood that has far more value for whatever reason than a neighborhood that's a block away that they're using as a comp. So, if you get a low appraisal and it's something that you want to challenge, reach out for help. Steve was actually a former appraiser, and I have quite a bit of experience, like coming up with values and comps, challenging appraisals. It's not a super easy process, but it can work.
Right.
It's sometimes I feel like it's more the listing agent's responsibility than it is the buyer's agent's responsibility. But when it comes down to it, sometimes the listing agent's not competent. enforcement
Right.
to do it. And so you kind of have to, if you want an appraisal appealed, you kind of have to take it into your own hands.
And like I said at the get-go, make sure your buyer wants that.
Right.
Because they may feel like, and then if you don't get their permission and then you appeal this appraisal, they could kind of later come back to you and argue, you made me overpay for an appraisal because you challenged it.
Yeah, like don't make that your first approach. Like first thing is always try to negotiate the purchase price down and see if you can get anywhere.
Right. Yep, I would agree with that. And even going back a little bit further, if you're representing the seller, make sure that they understand things like, okay, you put a $50,000 deck on your house, you're not going to get a $50,000 credit from the appraiser on
It's not
this.
gonna be dollar for dollar.
Yeah, it's not dollar for dollar. I mean, some sellers don't understand that either. Even, they're always like, well, I hear the highest return is on kitchens. I personally just remodeled my own kitchen in 2020. I know what I spent on it and I know what it increased the value of my house, and it's not what I paid for it.
But if you do leave a list of, to go back to sellers, like if there is a significant amount of improvements that you've made, I tell people, make a list of the improvements and what you spent on them.
Yeah.
Because if we leave that for the appraiser, that can have an impact.
Yep. Agreed. All right, that wraps up. Do you guys have any questions on, where are we?
We were talking at the beginning about the amendment thing.
So Nicole said she's bringing up the amendments on inspections again.
Did you talk about like negotiation from the standpoint of like, what did you negotiate up front for the transaction?
Actually, that's a very fair point. So if you guys couldn't hear Nicole, because we don't have a great, I don't know what happened with our owl here, but taking into consideration what you negotiated up front as well, right? Whether you represent the buyer or seller, if it's with the buyer and you got this house $20,000 less than asking, you got a 1-year home warranty, yeah, and 10,000 in seller paid. You may not be in a good position to be asking for additional repairs. The one that I was talking about with my electrical panel and we asked for all those things up front, we actually got like $10,000 less than list and 6% in seller paid closing costs on that one. And the seller said up front, don't expect anything in the inspection. Like you guys can go ahead and do an inspection, but it's going to be for your information only. Funny enough, we ended up negotiating another $5,000 off from that. But, sellers take that into consideration. It's also actually why I personally don't ask for home warranties up front. Unless my buyer waived the inspection, I might ask for it up front, but I typically don't ask for home warranties up front and use it as a negotiation tool later once I've done the inspection.
Yeah, so I was helping Mike Dix the other day with his question on inspection. And the first question I asked him is, what did you negotiate up front as far as your contract terms? Talk about what was the house list at? What did you get it for? What were the other terms of the initial agreement? Okay, now tell me about what the problems are in the inspection. Let's figure out.
Well, let's focus on safety and hazard and
Yeah, and he was like, some of it was water intrusion and moisture issues. So, sometimes it's just going back to the listing agent and having a conversation before you send an amendment saying, my buyer still wants this property, but we're concerned about these things. How do you feel like the seller will react to that? And what's the approach that you want me to take? Do you want me to ask for an extension on the home inspection so we can have somebody come in and look at moisture issues? Do you want me just to ask for the repairs and then handle it from there?
right.
Like maybe it's an elderly seller and they're not going to want to make the repairs. So maybe you ask for additional seller paid closing costs instead of actually burdening the seller with making the repairs.
Or you can also even have like repairs paid directly to a contractor and the repairs can be done post-closing. There's a lot of different ways to negotiate through those, but like Nicole said, a good approach. Well, someone just signed in, and I know it's getting really loud in here. So I don't know, Chelsea, were you guys even able to hear the last few minutes of Nicole and I talking?
You can kind of hear it, yeah. It's just like kind of
Okay.
muffled a little bit.
Hopefully it'll be better on the recording. Hopefully you guys took something away today about inspections and negotiating through them. Like Nicole said, there's lots of different options outside of just asking for repairs. At the end of the day, everybody wants the transaction to get to closing. So having communication with the agent on the other side is crucial as well.
And don't hesitate to reach out for help if you feel like you're, you know, in uncharted territory.
Right.
Or waters and want, you know, advice from someone with more experience. Like there's plenty of resources here on the team, and like Mike did, just post in Slack that you need help, or give Kassie a call, or I'm available as well.
All right, guys. Well, I'm going to end the recording for this session, and then we'll see you at noon for our team meeting. Stay warm and dry today.
Flexibility, right, with two